of the first dynasty. It's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And so they're kind of all connected in one way or another to Julius Caesar and to Augustus, whose other name is Octavian. Okay, so what's going to happen here is that Nero is an emperor who's been raised up to be in a powerful family. But, it's kind of like all those Netflix shows with all the backstabbing going on. These families were often really tough to deal with. Poisoning was not uncommon, stabbing people wasn't uncommon. It was really complicated. So we get him, and he's this guy who really loves poetry. He loves music. He likes to play something kind of like a fiddle or a violin. He likes to write plays. And this means that he's not as concerned and not as interested in political issues that don't have to do with the things that he cares about. Now, we don't know so much about his rule review of his dynasty and the historians of his dynasty, because that material's been lost. What we know about Nero comes from the succeeding dynasties, and they aren't so very nice about him. And that's something that's really common, is that basically the victors write the history. And so we lose out on some of the truths and realities. But what's the sordid story that goes with Nero? Well, he decides that, um, first there's a big fire. The fire burns a significant part of the city right near the old palace building. And he decides that the solution is not to rebuild all the buildings that burned down. Many of them were apartment houses. So, he got to live in a palace, and a lot of the wealthy got to have households. Most ordinary people lived in apartments. And these apartments were 6 to 7 stories high, and they were called insula. They were big block buildings, and you went up to the top all the way using stairs. So you can tell the cheapest rooms are the ones at the top. Well, that means that when the apartment houses are burning, that means that lots of people are losing their housing. So in an ideal world, we would say, sort of like, it's Gaza. All the buildings are ruined. Build new structures. I'm bad. I'm going to stop there. What he says is, no, let's not build apartments. Let's make this into a new palace. It's going to have a lake. It's going to be great. I'm going to be able to sail on my lake in boats. So it has to be deep enough for the boats to go on. And it's going to have a zoo. And not only is that, it's going to have a dining room. And the dining room is going to be extra cool because it's going to have a dome that will open up to the sky, and you can see the sky above. And then it's going to be up off the ground, and enslaved people are going to be underneath holding the beams of the floor of the dining room and rotating it so that you're slowly going around and around as you eat. You can imagine that people did not feel great about Nero. So he eventually commits suicide. But while he was emperor, we get to see one of the things that had happened. So starting with Augustus, a new rule is passed that in order to make the emperors make sense to people in other cultures that they're taking over, they need to basically say that they're kind of like Egyptian pharaohs who become godlike. And so they create what's called um, the imperial cult. And so if the Senate thinks you've been a good emperor for a little while, they will elevate you to the level of a god. And the god you get elevated to is this god called Helios, god of the sun. And of course, the sun god has rays of light poking out of his head like a crown. And so what we see here, we see an actual head of Nero over here, sculpted head of Nero. And then over there, we see a reconstruction of what a giant figure of Nero looked like. This one was supposed to be about 108 feet tall. And guess what? It was built on the parkland that was part of where the zoo and the park was that went with his palace. And this is called the Colossus of Nero. And he's got some interesting stuff going on here. He's on this huge platform. He's resting. What pose is he in?
The contrapositive.
He's in contrapposto pose. And remember, we just saw Augustus Suprema Porta, and he was actually wearing something that he's not.
Oh, toga.
Which is nothing?
We got nothing here. He's just naked as the day he was born. And that's because they're copying the Greek idealistic classical style. So we thought that the Augustus Suprema Porta was doing that, but now with Nero, we upped it up a couple notches to full Greek style nudity. And he's got the sun rays, his crown. And then right here, I want you to check this out. Does anybody know what this is?
I thought it was an umbrella, but I don't think that is.
It kind of looks like an umbrella.
Is it like a lance? Or you know like how what they use like in medieval times? Like
It's a lance.
okay.
It is not, but that is a great guess. It is a ship's rudder. He's basically saying, my ships rule the world, and here is a globe of the world underneath it. And this was something that the Romans would often say, we rule the world from the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the Chinese might have had something to say about that. That was a slight disagreement. But they didn't really know each other at the time. So he is full of power. He is literally steering the ship of the state from up here in this colossal image. Now, when he dies, they need a new emperor. So they get one. And so what would start happening is that instead of saying, this is the best person for the job, maybe the Senate gets together and elects someone, because remember, they don't have direct democracy. No, that doesn't happen. What happens is that the military forces that sort of work for and protect different generals start jockeying for who's going to be the next emperor. So you're getting these guys who their particular kind of legions really like them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're great leaders. And so this creates what's called the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero, these two other guys, and then finally the fourth guy. And his name is Vespasian. So when we look at Vespasian, what do we notice about his face compared to the Augustus Suprema Porta and the Nero?
He's old.
He's old. Does it remind you of anything that we studied in ancient Rome?
Is he a senator?
What was that?
Is he a senator?
He's a general. He's not a, he looks like something we've looked like before. What are the characteristics you notice on his face? He's got wrinkles, he's got sags.
Droopy eyes.
Droopy eyes, absolutely.
He's got the
Wrinkles on his
smile.
neck. Definitely balding. Hardly she is lift. Is this an idealized Greek style portrait?
No.
No.
Is it a Roman veristic sculpture?
Yes.
Remember verism? That's the picture of the old man who was a senator.
Yeah.
And that's where you'd have the wax masks made of these men's faces when they died to show their wisdom. He's saying, even though I'm emperor, I'm going to bring us back to the time when we idealized wisdom and age. I'm going to take us back to the Republic without taking us back to the Republic. All right, so what does he do? He gets in power. How does he get in power? How does he manage to be the one who makes it when three other emperors have gone down in the space of a year? Well, as a general, he was in charge of protecting all the grain coming out of Egypt, all the wheat that had to go to Italy to feed the people of Rome. And you know what he did? When he suddenly realized he has a chance to become emperor, he basically sends out words to the naval fleet that's got these huge, the biggest ships in the world, and they're all filled with wheat. And he says, stop the ships and go to harbor. And so basically, it's a threat. Rome will starve if they don't agree to have him as emperor. But he doesn't say, I'm going to starve you. He says, look, there's so much unrest with what's going on that I'm going to protect the grain ships, and so I'm going to park them. And we'll just wait till you guys figure out what you want to do. And after a while, people in Rome did decide what they wanted to do. They wanted to hire Vespasian to be the emperor so they could have grain. But there was another reason. His son, Titus, Titus, was also a general. He happened to be at a hot spot in the Roman Empire, and that is ancient Israel. And they're basically demanding that all the Jewish people of ancient Israel abandon ancient Israel, to make them leave and go away. Does any of this sound familiar to you? To be dispossessed. And so with their dispossession, they have to go other places. And they're already at war with the Romans. Why are they at war with the Romans? Well, they follow basically the Old Testament, which says, no other God before me, and these are gods. They can't accept leadership of government from people who claim to be gods. So there's a massive war, and basically takes several years that the Romans win, and everybody that they can capture or put to death. And the ones they capture are forced into slavery, and they are brought back to Rome, the city. They are paraded through the streets in a victory parade by Titus, and then those enslaved people are the ones who are responsible for building the Colosseum. The Colosseum is an amphitheater. It's the biggest amphitheater that was made in the ancient Roman Empire, and it's made by enslaved labor coming out of ancient Israel. If you ever wondered, why are there so many Jews in Europe? That's why, because they weren't allowed to be in the Holy Land. Now, some people managed to hide and stay secret, sort of like many Cherokee people managed to avoid being forced into the Trail of Tears by hiding in the mountains. And so similar things happened in ancient Israel. So there have always been Jewish people in that land for a very long time, but still, most of them are going to end up dispersed as enslaved people. And their first job is building this amazing and monstrous building. So let's take a look at it. So this is the Colosseum. And why do you think it has that name, Colosseum?
Because it's big.
It is big.
It's big.
What was that?
Because it's big.
It is big, but it's built when Vespasian decides to build it on the land of the palace and the park had been in the lake, which also means that it's the place where the Colossus of Nero was. The Colossus of Nero was just outside it. I think it's over in here. Would have been over here. So it gets called the Colosseum because it's near the Colossus of Nero. So let's take a look at it. One of the things that we can notice right away as we look down at it is that one side is much taller than the other. Part of that is because of deconstruction. Over the many centuries, many people have come to this building and used it as raw materials, carrying away all sorts of things. So we really see kind of the concrete and brick underlying structure of it. So this is the arena itself, and I want you to notice we have open barrel vaults here. The vaults have collapsed because they pulled the roofing off it and recycled it. But we have these huge vaults right here. And this was where you would have cubiculums and rooms for people who are about to go out there. They had places to keep different wild animals, places to keep all the gear. So the gladiators didn't just fight with your basic Roman armor. They had 5 different categories of armor that they had, and some of them were wearing tridents and kind of sea armor and acting like they're Poseidon or they're the warriors of Poseidon. So they have all these different roles and gear that they could wear to go out and fight. Now, all of these people were enslaved and they're fighting for their lives. Their lives were short, but they could be rented out to interested people who wanted to have an encounter with a gladiator. And there was a kind of popular culture around the gladiators. So people are writing graffiti on the wall saying, Gustavus is adorable. I love his trident. So it's a little shocking. It's a little, I was offended when I was your age to discover this licentious, shocking kind of thing going on. Okay, one of the things that they could do in this is the whole thing has this kind of solid floor over the top. It's the ceilings of these barrel vaults right here. And they could flood this thing with water coming in from the aqueducts. And they could make it, so it was about 3.5 to 4 feet deep, and they could float small triremes in here, which are the warships, and they could reenact sea battles. Then they would open up these massive drains, and the water would flow out to the rivers, and they just had to wait for the sand to dry. So that was pretty impressive technology. They had lifting technology to lift up the wild animals, and they had entrances at different parts. You didn't just enter at the ends, which is what I think we often see when we see reenactments in TV and movies. They could have lift materials that would lift up creatures that would pop up out of the floor. So it was really all about spectacle. So we often think of the Colosseum as being a place where people are being punished. But it's actually a place where you have a lot of enslaved people who are going to die, but they were considered good warriors, and for a while they had a sort of okay but horrible life. Has anybody ever watched Gladiator 1 or Gladiator 2? You know a little bit about that. But where it starts with is having these gladiatorial combat games starts out as a way for aristocrats, when they had a male family member who would die, they would invite warriors to come and fight in honor of the dead. So their funeral fight. And somehow that gets transformed into being public spectacle. So this idea of public spectacle is called the bread and circus. So bread refers to the fact that every Roman family was guaranteed a certain portion of wheat that should ideally, if they're careful, help sustain them throughout the year. So it's supposed to last until the next portion of wheat comes, and it's a fair amount of wheat. So that's the bread in bread and circuses. This is money that basically food that the government is giving you just to survive. And then we have the circus. And this is to distract you from the chaos, the death, the slaughter that's going on as Rome is expanding its empire. And so they have all these entertainments. They have the circus, which is literally a horse racing track, a really scary horse racing track. It's a horse race with chariots. I guess we could call it a chariot racing track. And you know how we look at like the Daytona 500 or NASCAR, we have these big oval tracks with plenty of room for the cars at high speeds to go around? Well, they had 2 obelisks, and the horses would run straight down one side of the obelisk, make a really tight turn, crash into other chariots and other horses, and the ones that survived would come racing back. Sometimes they would do that 3 laps, and there was carnage everywhere. But this was another kind of circus. It wasn't called a circus, but it was effectively working like a circus. It's distracting people. They're getting into the sport of it. They're betting. It's like caring about basketball or football or rugby and being less concerned with things around you, distracting you from political realities. So we call that bread and circus, and Vespasian was a master of it. Okay, so now we're looking at the outside of the Colosseum. One thing I want you guys to notice, it is very hard to see, I apologize, is that we have columns, and we can see that each row of columns is a little bit different. These have been lost, these are kind of flat, you can see them right here. And they're variations, Roman interpretations of Greek orders. So the columns like the Doric and the Ionic style. So we've got a Tuscan style, this one's the Tuscan style. So all of these are these kind of Romanifications still of things Greek. The whole amphitheater is a Greek theater, two of them together like this. So we talked about that when we talked about Pompeii. But remember, the hill that they make that holds up the Greek theaters that come together is made entirely of barrel vaults. These barrel vaults come in towards that center, and they are lifting up the seats. The seats operate very much like seats in a sports stadium today. They were divided into sections. Senators and their families and the imperial class got to sit at the lowest level closest to what was happening, where poor people and women who were kind of unaccompanied would be up at the top level. And you basically had a ticket that would tell you where to go inside here. Now notice that we have what seemed like a lot of doors. And not all of these were doorways, but some of them lead to doorways. Altogether, there were about 80 entrances into the Colosseum on the different levels. And these came to be called vomitoriums, like a vomiting. And this is because when the games were over, all these people would come pouring out, and it was like vomit. Now you might say, why would they come up with that idea? That's really gross. Well, the aristocrats really liked to have feasts, and they would invite high status friends, and they would have the best of everything, and they would have huge amounts of food. And when you would be invited to one of these feasts, you knew you couldn't eat all the food that was offered, and yet it would be rude and weak to not eat the food, especially for the men. So the men would bring along an enslaved servant with a bowl and a feather.
Oh.
So that when they'd had enough to eat and they couldn't possibly face anything else, they'd wave over their servant, stick the feather down their throat, and vomit into the bowl. And the servant would take this away and clean it, and they're now ready to eat more food and drink more alcohol. And let's call this the vomitorium. All right, now when we look at it today, we are looking at the concrete surfaces. The whole thing was covered on the outside with marble, and it was beautiful. Remember Augustus saying that he found Rome a city of bricks and he turns it into a city of marble? Well, this isn't under Augustus, it's under Vespasian, but it's covered in marble, it's really beautiful. Once the Roman Empire collapsed, then lots of people would go up and get some nice marble off the outside of this building and use it for their own purposes. Okay, here's how we can see the barrel vaults working in here. So look at my cursor. We've got stacked barrel vaults, so that means all the weight and pressure is coming down one on top of the other, so everything is very stable. This is important, but they've got this really strong material, concrete. You can see that they're making their own hillside to have their seats on. And here are the stairs leading up to the seats. Up at the very top, they had some shade protection. And that shade protection was covered with canvas cloth that basically acted like sun protection at the highest level. But you're really far from what's happening down on the ground, so you have to choose your options. And of course, this is the battlefield right there. Okay, so now we are moving away from this gladiatorial site, and we are looking at some of the sculpture. So we've got this head of a Flavian woman. So Vespasian was Vespasian Flavianus, I can say this, Flavianus, yes. So we call them Flavians, he and his two sons, Titus and Domitian. And this is one of the women married into the family. This is a portrait of her. The Romans were really into busts, not full sculptures, just kind of stopping here. The Greeks did that too, but not as much. The Romans took the idea and said, let's run with it. She's made out of this lovely marble, and her hair is amazing. Her hair is made to look like she's used, well, not her, her servants have used curling rods to curl her hair. If we were to see her from the back, we would see that her hair is really flat here, and it stands up really tall here. So it looks a little weird from the back, but the front looks amazing. Now, look at her curls. They're made, we have to think about the technical process. They're made by drilling. Now, they don't have electric drills, obviously. They have hand drills.
Oof.
And they're drilling into these to get these lovely internal curls and this dark contrast between the light outside on her hair and the shadows inside the curls. Very labor intensive, very naturalistic, very elegant, very high status because she's able to literally spend so much time getting her hair done. Okay, so Vespasian dies before the Colosseum is finished. But his son Titus then becomes the next leader. He's the one who was in charge of the exodus of the Jews from ancient Israel. And here is the triumphal arch. Now, this wasn't put up when he was alive. What's interesting about triumphal arches in ancient Rome is that at first, in the Republican period, all the arches were made out of wood and transitory materials. And you put up an arch and you let the general go through with his military forces and all the spoils of war, and then they took it down. It was over. But here in the imperial period, they decide that they need these triumphal arches to show the power of Rome. So we got propaganda happening here. They want to make them permanent. Now, Titus dies after a very short term in office. He basically gets sick, and that's the end of the game. And his brother Domitian then becomes emperor. And Domitian wants to remember his brother, and a lot of people weren't confident about Domitian. He wasn't a general. And so he's trying to play on his brother's fame a little bit. So he decides to erect a permanent marble and concrete version of one of these victory arches, which is what they are. And so it says here at the top, Senatus, can you see that? That V shape for Senatus is, they didn't have a U and a V, they just had the U sound. And they made the V shape for it. The Senate and the Republic, the people of Rome, have chosen Titus Vespasianus as a god. So he's elevated to the level of being part of the imperial cult. And when we pass through in here, we walk through this, we get to see some more propaganda celebrating his work. And here we see the sacking of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and all the stuff being carried out, including a menorah. Here come the standards, etc. And these are the Roman forces carrying them along. These are relief sculptures that are inside this. Okay, so we have this idea of these triumphal arches becoming permanent. And so architecture is becoming ever more important for the political power of the Roman Empire. And so we get to this, and this is called the Pantheon. Yay, got a few more minutes. Okay, so the Pantheon is pretty cool, because remember I talked to you about arches and barrel vaults and cross vaults? Here we are with a dome. We can just see the dome up at the top. And remember, a dome is just an arch that spins 360 degrees on its axis, and that makes a dome shape. So this emperor, in this case, his name is Hadrian, is deciding to rebuild a building that was a temple. And this temple had burned down twice. And so he's rebuilding on the site, and he wants to acknowledge the guy who first made the first one, whose name is Marcus Agrippa. So we see up here on the top, M. Agrippa. And because they didn't really have spacing like we have now with their letters, they would put dots in between them to kind of show, oh, that's not part of this other word. So we've got this pediment up here, and of course this was marble clad up on top, and then we have these beautiful stones. And I want you to notice we have this interesting shape we haven't seen before in temple form, which is this kind of rectangular thing behind the pediment sticking out there. And then above that, we can see the wall supporting the dome, and then the dome itself. This lovely fountain is much, much later. That's from the Baroque period. We're talking 1630. It's nothing like this time. So we're talking about 140 right now, CE. So this says Marcus Agrippa's made this, but actually it's Hadrian. And Hadrian wants to have a building, a temple, that takes that public architecture to a new level. And so he says, hey, look, we control Egypt. What we're going to do is we're going to put stones from all across the Roman Empire in this building. So everybody across the empire has a stake in the empire. And one of the things that they would do is they'd go and take over places like Israel, like Syria. And very quickly, they would build Roman architecture in those places. And so they'd have a little amphitheater where plays could be done as well as gladiatorial combat. They would have public baths. We might not take that seriously, but public baths were amazing. Like on Tuesdays and Thursdays, women could come and take baths. On all the other days, men could come and take baths. You had to pay a little bit to do this, but you would have a sauna, you would have a hot bath, you would have a kind of a tepid bath, which they called the tepidarium. And then they would have the cold water bath, which was like a swimming pool, and that was called the frigidarium. And then you could have a snack bar. There was often a library inside, and somebody would brush your wool toga and make it look all nice again. So, out here in the Roman provinces, a lot of people very quickly become part of the system of ancient Rome. A lot of them immigrate to other places, they join the Roman military, and they become part of Roman culture. And part of the way they did that was literally through their architecture, by setting up a kind of architecture that had never existed in that place before, and it had sewer lines and water lines. So much better than what their parents had had. So he wants to show the grandeur of Rome with this building. So he says, hey, I want to get some of the biggest columns ever made to come out of the Egyptian quarries. The Egyptian quarries were in the mountains near the Red Sea, and they kept trying to send these beautiful columns down the switchback road from the quarry in the mountains down to the lower levels where they could then haul them by mule trains to the sea, put them on their barges and take them to Rome. But the only problem is that they were too long, because they were actually about this high. And the switchbacks were not that long. When you put the switchbacks, you imagine you have this coming down on wheeled vehicles, and you have like 20 mules pulling. The switchbacks were too close together, and so what kept happening is that those giant columns would go plunging down the side of the mountain, along with the mule teams and many of the people who were working to get it down the hillside. So eventually, Hadrian's told, we can't get you the columns. And so they have to change the design. These are the biggest ones they could get safely out. And that means that now you can see this, which would have been hidden behind the temple front. And inside and on the outside, it would have had that cladding we talked about before. So that decorative stone that's put on the outside to make it look beautiful. Now let's look at the inside. It's really pretty impressive. It's about 142 feet high from the floor to the top and across. You can put a perfect sphere inside it. Now, Hadrian had been trained by Greek tutors, and these Greek tutors were in high demand. They were often enslaved philosophers. And he had learned about Platonic theory in Plato, and he had also learned about Neoplatonic theory, and that was called the New Plato scholars. And they talked about how Plato was looking for ideal government, ideal forms that the gods created, and how we try to have government in the image of what the gods created. And so they talked about the circle as the most perfect of all forms. And so he says, let's make a beautiful building that has a whole sphere inside it. Perfection. You can see it's pretty impressive. Now, they have half-barrel vaults in here, supported by columns and walls that help support the ceiling. But what's really important is that inside they have barrel vaults going all the way around. They have short barrel vaults in these walls as well to help, just like the Colosseum, they're going in this way to help hold up the walls and the weight of the dome. But there's one last thing I want to tell you about this building before you go, because it's highly likely to show up on the test. To make this concrete building work, they put denser, heavier concrete mixtures on the bottom, medium density concrete in the middle parts, and by the time they're getting up to the dome, they're using volcanic ash to help make their concrete so it's as light as possible. So they're using different recipes for the concrete so the dome will not collapse. And on that note, we're going to pick up talking about the symbolism of this building next time.